Hello, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hastings County for another TTRPG Talk. This video series discusses tabletop role-playing games and related materials, makes suggestions for your own games, and takes a look at some of my own materials. Today we're going to be taking a look at SRDs again. This one will be a video on the Rise SRD that was created by Rolf Mayemberger. This is the second edition that I will be outlining. There weren't very many differences between first edition and second edition. Second edition more added some extra materials that we'll be discussing more towards the end of this video. But one reason why this video is being created now is because this is currently in a jam. So we'll again also be outlining the specifics of the jam, like the dates and stuff, towards the end. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And now let's go ahead and get started digging a bit more into this system reference document. Rise was created by Rolf Mayemberger, who primarily publishes on itch.io and on social media under the WuDeRPG name. They have that particular name comes from the WuD or Five Powers system that they had created and created an SRD for. I have discussed that previously on the blog, and I actually utilized it for one of my own games, that one being Saguk Roleplay in Joseon. Rise, meanwhile, was originally created for Ralph's game Rise of the Apes, which is an adaptation of the newest Planet of the Apes movie series, the ones that had Andy Serkis playing the chimpanzee Caesar. And that series, if you're not aware of it, basically was telling like the origins and original evolution of the apes, the intelligent apes that later would go on to replace humanity after the nuclear catastrophe that is outlined in the original movie series. That was released back in when was that? The 70s or the 80s? Rise creates a 3-act structure that allows you to evolve your character over the course of play. In the original game, this of course meant the literal evolution of your character. As we mentioned previously, the apes slowly evolved as they were exposed to the mutation virus that had originally caused the increase in their intelligence and such in the movie. Each act in this game adds elements to your character to make your character more complex, and also makes the actual play of the game more dynamic as you go. To quickly illustrate each of these acts, we of course start with a character that only has raw basic attributes. In Act 2, we then add skills on top of this. This helps introduce specialities, of course, and also increasing complexity in the abilities of your character. Finally, once we hit Act 3, we are introducing resources. These allow us to kind of push the character's capabilities to the max by adding a sort of ticking clock to the climax of the story, because the resources limit the number of times in which a particular character could do actions. And this also introduces an element of tactical complexity and forces you to either rely on other players instead of trying to do lots of things by yourself, or if you're playing by yourself or with a small group, depending upon how the game is structured, it forces you to potentially accept failure sometimes by, instead of relying on your highest quality traits and skills and attributes, sometimes you have to rely on other abilities that you might have that are not necessarily so well developed. Now let's take a bit of a deeper look at each of the elements that creates that character that we just mentioned when we were outlining exactly what the acts were. Rise SRD generally suggests starting off with a small number of broad attributes. The defaults basically are 3. In each of these, we have physical, which of course describes the actual body of your character and what they can do with it. Mental is, of course, the mind, the brain, and what you can think and stuff, or do mentally. And social are like the social and the interactive abilities of your character. Um, it generally recommends that when you are creating your character, that each of these attributes start at 1, and then you distribute an additional 3 to 5 points amongst them. There aren't any mentions of minimums or maximums, other than obviously you can't really have one drop below 1. Um, but aside from that, that is the basics that we have here. Obviously, when you're creating your own game using the system, you might choose to put a cap, like maybe 3 or maybe put a cap of like 4 points in each of them or 5 points in each of them. So then they're not putting like, you have 611. But not that that would generally be recommended. But the basic idea is that whenever your character is doing an action that potentially utilizes one of these attributes, each of the points for the attribute then contributes an additional die to the dice pool. Moving on to Act 2, as we mentioned, we are going to be adding skills. Generally, it's recommended that you add 3 skills per attribute. 2 of these are pretty much generic and are listed below on the slide here, and 1 is typically recommended to be specialized or specially edited and suited for your particular game setting. So, for example, you might choose to have the physical skill be related to a particular form of combat, or you might want the mental skill to be specifically focused on a particular type of research or something if you're doing like a science related game. Maybe the social one might be related to language if you're dealing with large numbers of groups that might have different languages and you're having to communicate between them. Those are all different ways that you could kind of take a look at that. Basically, as we mentioned, each of these are basically assigned in groups of 3 to a particular trait. So as you can see here, with the generic ones, for physical we have strength and agility. Mental we'd have knowledge and awareness. Social we'd have interaction and intuition. And as I mentioned, each of those would also have a skill that is specialized to the setting of the game. The ranks each of these skills, basically you can assign as many points to these skills as you have equal to the attribute it's associated with. So for example, if I had 5 points assigned to the mental attribute, then I could have up to 5 points assigned across each of the 3 skills associated with that attribute. So I could do like 2 1 2 1 2, 3 2 0, 3 1 1, 5 0 0. I'm not entirely sure why you necessarily want to have that many points assigned to a particular skill, but it's entirely possible. Either way, that's generally how you would assign points. Now, of course, we have the resources that were introduced in Act 3. In each, you should have a resource assigned for each of your attributes. So, for example, in the Rise of the Apes game, one of the resources that was assigned to the social attribute was command, where basically this is like your ability or the a level of influence and command that you have over fellow apes, or something along those lines. So, the basic idea is that again, these are a limited resource. Each time that you attempt to utilize an attribute, you would basically be burning one of those points. And usually, the base game, the base SRD basically suggests that you have like 5 points for each of the resources. Because of that, of course, that means that you can only really act 15 times in Act 3, at least with your particular character. And of course, you might not necessarily want to utilize all 15 of those because, of course, in some of those attributes, you might not necessarily be all that skilled. So again, this sort of adds a layer of having to depend on others or having to potentially rely on other abilities or resources or elements that you might have introduced into your game to kind of layer on top of this. Some of those recommendations we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, it definitely requires that your player, think really deeply into whether or not they want to act and how they want to act and to interact with a particular situation is in that sort of Act 3. Um, so it adds a ticking clock, not only because, of course, you can utilize clocks to try to see, like, how quickly, how much time they've got to finish something, or how much more effort they need to put into something to finish it, but also there's this ticking clock of you can only act so much before basically you can't really do anything more to act and influence the situation. The Rise SRD does have a sort of default dice mechanics. These are the dice mechanics that were uh, created to be utilized in the Rise of the Apes game, which, as I had previously alluded to, are built around d6s. So, building the dice pool is you always automatically start off with 1d6. Um, then you add on top of that a number of d6s equal to the attribute plus the skill that you're potentially utilizing for your roll. So, for example, if I have if I'm doing a social roll, right, and I have a social of 2 and the skill, whatever the skill that I'm utilizing is also a 2, then I would be adding 4d6 to the original d6 that I had. So that would be 5. Um, and then you can potentially add another 1d6 if another character or a major NPC or something is assisting your character. Once the dice are rolled, then you count up the number of dice that potentially had show a 4 or better. Um, and those basically are the successes. If you have only one dice that shows a 4 or better, then you have success with complication. 2 would be just a regular straight success. 3 would be a success with benefit. 2 or 3 sixes would be a great benefit. So essentially, this is like a super critical success. There is also the option of having a failure but with a benefit should you have snake eyes, so basically rolling 2 ones. Um, I didn't mention that on the slide here, but that is something that is mentioned in the rules of the game. Obviously, if you didn't roll any successes, then you fail, unfortunately. Number of other dice mechanics, though, utilizing d6s that Ralph does suggest that you could potentially utilize if you want your game that you're building off of the Rise SRD to have a particular feel that sort of more closely matches some other game systems that exist out there already. I'm not necessarily going to go into the very nitty gritty specifics of these mechanics because obviously you can just take a read of them yourself in the game. In the SRD, the SRD manual. But the 4 different types that they suggest would be a sort of more Blades in the Dark feeling game, more of an OSR, sort of like based off of primarily the dice system used in Barbarians of Lemuria. There is a Savage Worlds suggested dice system, and then also one that utilizes bidding combined with opposed dice pools. So basically, the player is rolling a dice pool and the game master is rolling a dice pool against each other. And that's primarily based off of Dogs in the Vineyard. So those are 4 different potential dice systems that are suggested that you could use potentially instead of the default. Just to kind of outline some of the other mechanics or elements that Rise talks about that you might potentially want to utilize in your games, there is, of course, a section talking about how you might want to utilize specific goals or a clock system to potentially trigger the sort of transition from one act to another, or elements within the acts to sort of, especially if you are utilizing, for example, clocks to figure out when the characters are successful at achieving their goals when they need to decide when, like, Act 3 ends in particular. Um, Another element that existed in the Rise of the Apes game was it utilized sparks, These were used to sort of illustrate special abilities that might be, for example, limited use things so that you can accomplish certain things without having to roll. Or sparks could also be like essentially your system's version of magic, which again might be attached to a limited resource, or might require that, or might be something that triggers when a certain roll occurs. That also introduces the concept of bonds and assets. Again, these are things that you could potentially utilize that might replace a roll or boost a roll or do something along those lines, or might even allow certain types of rolls in the first place. Ralph also suggests that obviously it's entirely possible that instead of just having your players just build your characters from scratch, that you might want to introduce playbooks, especially if you want to create certain specialized, not necessarily classes, but types of characters. And also, again, that might be useful for quick pickup games if you're introducing those sparks, bonds, and assets to decrease the complications of choice when it comes to getting a game off the ground quickly. Finally, they do suggest that you do, even though this is even though the mechanics in this game are really intended, at least I feel, for one shots, they do suggest that it's entirely possible for you to potentially create, especially short story arc campaigns. For example, maybe each section introduces, each session is its own act, or maybe you could have Act 1 be sort of like the introduction to the system. You do that for a round or two, and then you add Act 2, you're adding extra layers, and then you primarily stay in Act 2 until you reach an element of conclusion, where you would then introduce the resources and elements and things from Act 3. And then potentially you could scale back to Act 2 once that particular situation is resolved, until that you come to the next crisis point, like facing the next big bad or something along those lines. Now, why would you want to use Rise? Well, Rise is pretty nice for creating characters as you play. Obviously, with each act, you're introducing new mechanics to things. So it definitely is good at introducing, particularly new players who are newer to role playing games or newer to not playing one particular system, like let's say Dungeons and Dragons. This, of course, creates only a limited amount of pre-prep for your players, and definitely allows you to easily teach the basics of the mechanics as you go up the acts before things get more complicated, and potentially avoiding overwhelming people with increasing complexity too quickly. This is also obviously a great system for creating compelling 3-act stories with satisfying conclusions. This definitely would, especially if you provide a lot of scenario or game master resources with your game that you create from this system. So if you're including like lots of randomization tables and stuff like that, it definitely makes it a lot easier for a GM to essentially make up the scenario on the fly or follow a sort of set piece that later they can kind of craft and tweak and make their own, but would be good for especially a first-time GM or a GM with very limited time to potentially create new stories or stuff utilizing this system. This is definitely a system intended for shorter games, as I mentioned previously, which especially for one-shots, which of course makes it great for pickup games or just really short story arcs, something you throw in between campaigns of a different role-playing game. Again, this could be a great thing another great marketing tool if you're attempting to, try to get your gaming group to potentially try out a new game utilizing this engine, whether it's one that you crafted yourself or one created by somebody else, like Rise of the Apes. It's definitely potentially useful for trying to pull in players who are newer to RPGs or aren't used to playing other RPGs or only used to playing other RPGs of a particular type. So yeah, definitely allowing you to sort of broaden people's horizons in short bursts of time. So that was Rise. Thank you again. Again, this was created by Ralph Meyenberger. A link to the SRD will be found in the description down below, in addition to a link to the jam. This is actually the second Rise jam, so actually I'll include links to both the first and the second jam down below. Partly in case you're interested in checking out the second jam, but also then so you can potentially take a look at some of the games that were created the first time round. So definitely be sure to check that out. Thank you all for joining us. Don't forget to rate your itch purchases and SRDs. Remember, you don't actually have to buy it on itch in order to put a rating. So definitely a great way to thank creators, especially if you're potentially getting something up utilizing a community copy, or if you're getting a pay what you want style game and you're not necessarily throwing in some money. A rating is always great because it pushes people up the itch charts and all that kind of stuff. And have a good zone.